Good morning, Warsaw. Today is Thursday, 17 August. It will be fine but cloudy in the evening with highs of 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit for our American listeners. Sunrise will be at 5:38 a.m. and sunset at 8:14 p.m. We are on the 17th day of the Warsaw Uprising and daily life is still ongoing. But Claire will talk more about that later. Otherwise, Alina, what else is happening during the uprising?
Thanks for that, Philippe. We're on day 17, so over 2 weeks of the Warsaw Uprising. But nothing's really changed in the old town. It's still constantly under attack. There are hundreds of thousands of bombs being dropped constantly, all night, bombing raids, Nebelwerfer. People are sheltering in the cellars. There is a lack of food, there's a lack of water, and the situation's pretty dire in the old town. But Claire, what else is going on?
Well, sticking with the old town, I've got a story about Kazimierz Bilski, who was this officer, a member of the Polish Special Forces paramilitary, the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen. And he's this chap who Zoe had met in London when she was serving in London earlier on in 1943. She is parachuted back to Poland a few months before the uprising, and Bilski is sent in by aircraft, in the aircraft that is sent in to pick up the parts of the V2 missile to be taken back for test by the Allies. And so he arrives and he is immediately put into a battalion, which has taken the name after his code name. When he had been in London, had been recruited into the Cichociemni, his commanding officer had called him up in front of his desk and told him he was now in and he should choose a new code name. And Rum was hadn't really predicted this was going to happen. So he looked above his boss's desk and on the shelves behind him were full of these important books, and Rum wasn't much of a reader. And the only thing he liked on those shelves was a bottle of rum. So that's how he took his name Rum. So I've got to love him. Anyhow, he is back and he is now serving he's leading a battalion in the old town. He hears that supplies can't reach him. He needs more ammunition for his men, also more small arms, and the supplies can't get through because there is a German sniper preventing that much needed ammunition from reaching his battalion. So he decides that this is a job that he needs to undertake himself, and he creeps into the old town. This just gives you a bit of an idea of the sort of thing that many people were undertaking at this time. So he has to climb up to the staircase of the ruined building that the sniper is using from the top floor. He has to sort of carefully avoid all the rubble on the bomb-damaged stairs because he knows that any scrape or clatter is going to betray him as he slowly climbs up to the top floor. He later wrote that a damp smell permeated the area and sunlight bounced off the dust particles in the air. I kind of imagine it as this little lacuna, a quiet moment in the middle of the fighting. Certainly that's how it seemed to him. Apparently the door at the top creaked a little as he turned it, and Rum saw the sniper reach for his Luger, but Rum was faster with his Visradum pistol, and he shot first. And when the German sniper lay motionless on the ground, Rum went over to take a look and said that his grey-green woolen jacket was now stained with blood. He took the Luger, that's a useful bit of kit, and he searched for ammunition. And a front pocket of this German's jacket revealed some letters and a photograph, and it was clearly him, the German officer, and his family, including his wife and some children in a garden. And along with the photographs, there was a letter from his wife, and the German's wife had written to him, "So long as your heart is still beating, I am alive." And for a moment, Rum was really stumped. He sort of paid his silent respects to this fighter. Just that week, although he didn't know it, his own wife, who was in the WAF, Audrey North, she had confided to her rather tear-stained diary, "I've been reading your recent letters and I need and want you so much." And you just get this picture of young men serving on both sides of the conflict. And I'm not trying to say there's any equivalence here. Rum is defending his home, his capital city, the centre of his nation. This German sniper, he is from a much better equipped force that are the aggressors, that are driving civilians as well as armed forces out of their own sovereign territory. So there is no equivalence, but it does just highlight this this moment of human tragedy at the centre of all this.
The Germans constantly dehumanised the Poles, especially during the uprising, so it's very interesting how you brought this element of being able to humanise the enemy or humanise the Germans at this stage, because yes, they did write a lot of letters. We'll have a couple of these later on in the podcast, and it's a really interesting point. Thank you for that.
I think it's important to remember that we are talking about human beings, and as soon as anyone starts using dehumanising language, scum, ants, whatever, then we are getting into trouble. So I think we always need to remember that both sides had young men and young women indeed serving, but that isn't to argue that there's any equivalence in the actions of these opposing forces. So that's what's happening in the old town at the moment, but I think there's other resistance going on in the forest areas as well that we haven't yet spoken about, Alina.
So let's talk about something we've mentioned very briefly, but we haven't really talked much about, and those are the units that are outside of Warsaw. So, for example, those in the Hojnowski Forest or in the Campinos. I want to take us back, about 2 weeks, because I want to talk a little bit about the Campinos Forest, because their initial target was the Modlin airport. Some of you may have flown into it, but at that point, the Campinos unit was supposed to be attacking the airport. They had 3 companies and a total of 190 soldiers. This is exactly at 5 p.m. on our W. Unfortunately, their forces were just not sufficient enough to capture the heavily fortified airport. They were ordered to engage with the enemy in order to relieve the Żoliborz and Bielany, so units in the northern part of the city that were supposed to be carrying out their tasks. But unfortunately, they had to retreat. They suffered losses because the German superior firepower was felt increasingly. They were running out of ammunition and supplies, and after 2 hours of fighting, they withdrew further into the Campinos forest. So about 5 soldiers were killed, 12 were wounded, and the German losses were estimated at 6 killed and 10 wounded. Over the night of the 1st and 2nd of August, other units managed to reach the concentration site, meaning 2 infantry battalions, a cavalry division, and a heavy machine gun squadron, which totaled 984 soldiers. So in the early morning, they started another attack. They lost their idea of surprise, and unfortunately, quite a few of the commanders were killed in the attack, because the Germans were well prepared to defend themselves this time. The idea of idea of surprise just didn't exist at this point. The enemy firepower overwhelmed the attackers, and there were a lot of dead and wounded. The insurgents were fighting against superior armour and aircraft, and they just couldn't. They were running out of ammunition. It was just not possible. So they managed to break through the defence and congregated up in the Campinos forest area. The losses were significant, so 31 soldiers were killed and 45 wounded. The German losses were estimated at 20 killed and 30 wounded. What was very interesting is that they managed to destroy several trucks in the fight, and they also captured 16 rifles, 3 pistols, and a load more ammunition. Even though this was not a successful mission, they did not capture the airport. They did inflict enough damage on the airport that meant that the Germans could no longer use it. The insurgents then withdrew into the Campinos forest, and another battle was fought the following day on the 3rd of August, where they crushed a Wehrmacht company who were marching from Leszno to Modlin, where 70 Germans were killed, 19 wounded, and 15 were taken prisoner. This was an incredible victory for the insurgents. It really lifted their spirits. There was another unit that managed to join them, the Palmyre Młociny Regiment, which numbered over 1,400 soldiers, and there were a large influx of other units from other regions, as well as others who just couldn't continue their fight or couldn't get into Warsaw and were looking for opportunities to be able to continue the fighting. And also individual soldiers ended up joining. So the Campinos Forest, we will come back to some of the battles later on in the podcast, but I thought it's worth it. Not everything was happening within the city of Warsaw. It was also happening outside in the forest area. So I think that's quite important to mention that. Let's move on to something positive. Claire, tell us something good.
Yes, I mean it seems strange to say this in the middle of this appalling conflict. But there are chinks of light. I think there was a chink of light in the humanity that Rum recognises in the enemy soldier that he has just shot in the course of duty, and that there is stuff as well. I mean, if you look at the civilian population, the way they're trying to keep their spirits up, trying to preserve community despite all these pressures, and also trying to look after the younger residents, because, of course, in the middle of all this horror, we have several thousand civilian children caught up. Some of those, the older of the children among them, some of them are serving in the grey ranks, so that's the scouts, the boys and girls serving as messengers in the scouting groups, but there's a lot of younger children as well. And on the 17th of August, there's this wonderful example. It's the premiere of a traditional puppet theatre, which has been put together to try and lift the spirits of the children, to distract them from what's going on. And it's produced by... it's created by a man called Michał Dadlacz, and parts of it are written by Zofia Renzonova. And the music is provided by an accordionist, Jaglas. So it is this lovely, it's very colourful, it's a very lively show. And I think what's really important is it's a comedy. So it's something to really lift the spirits of the young people. It's witty, and it's also very topical. So it's not trying to patronise the children. It is a comedy in 2 acts, but it is talking about their experiences. So it's quite a good way for them to think about their experiences and try and process it as well. So in this play, they see puppets playing other, very spirited children on the stage there, and they're given names like, well, one of them's called Wimp, but another one is Gossip Girl, and there's Dragonfly, and one is called Freeman. And the only baddie in the show is a puppet called Tiger, who's clearly demarked by having a swastika on his back. And this tiger is quickly stopped by the children. And as he dies, there is the plaintive sounds of the march Deutschland unter alles being played. And this little travelling puppet theatre was taken around the city and performed in various courtyards during small moments of peace when there wasn't a raid going on in the areas held by the partisans. So it shows the community, again, coming together to think of something that we might not immediately think of being part of a military campaign. And yet it is so important to try and bolster the spirits of the Polish civilian population, including the children. So there is this extraordinary cache of photographs showing this puppet show and showing other concerts, cinema and performances. And all of that is going to be used later, isn't it? Because a lot of this is put together and then filmed overseas. But Roger, what is the opinion from overseas at this point? How are people regarding the uprising progress?
Yeah, it's an interesting point, because the issue of Poland was always going to be a sort of profound sticking point between the allies of the Grand Alliance. Of course, it was Poland, as we know, that the British went to war for in 1939, however ineffectually. And then with the Soviets joining the Grand Alliance after being attacked in 1941, then that Poland was, from a Soviet perspective, was seen as part of their sphere of influence. So this was always going to cause ructions between the Allies at this time. So when Poland's future is being decided, and this is the time of the Warsaw Rising is very much where those questions are being asked. Some examples for the first time amongst the sort of corridors of power of the Grand Alliance. And interestingly, in Moscow, the American ambassador in Moscow, Avril Harriman, was one of the most hawkish actually on this, and particularly sort of in anti-Soviet sentiment. And he's a very interesting character. He was very much larger than life. He was a millionaire in his own right as a businessman, and he's one of those people. Roosevelt had this sort of habit or tradition of very often appointing his own friends and his own people that he respected from outside of politics or outside of the diplomatic world to take these sort of prominent posts. And he'd originally sent Harriman to London in 1941 to sort of smooth Anglo-American relations in the run-up to the American entry into the war in December of 41. So he was very much trusted by Roosevelt. And on the 17th of August, bearing in mind the immediate background to this was that the Soviets had been backtracking on claiming that they were disavowing the Warsaw Rising, that they weren't going to allow Allied aircraft to land on Soviet soil to refuel and return. So, therefore, really hindering any sort of Allied assistance to the Warsaw Rising. So, on the background of that, Harriman writes a letter to Roosevelt in which he advocates sending Stalin what he calls a very strong message that he will then personally deliver. And he writes to Roosevelt saying, "We cannot, repeat not, accept the Soviet position when they allow the Poles fighting in Warsaw to be killed without lifting a hand and arbitrarily prevent us from making efforts to assist." So he's really trying to give Roosevelt a lead, quite stern wording, that he can then present to Stalin and sort of try and get some sort of united front between the British and the Americans in confronting that Soviet position. So it's interesting how that you can see Warsaw is really, the question of Warsaw is really exposing the cracks in the Grand Alliance, and it's people like Harriman are very often, the most clear-sighted in analysing the situation.
Right, moving away from foreign opinion, we haven't spoken about what the Germans are up to today.
Yeah, there's a couple of really good sort of original German accounts which we've got, which I think show the sort of fierceness, the severity of the fighting in Warsaw. And increasingly the Germans are being surprised by this. I mean, I think they might have been planning for this is a sort of standard crushing of an uprising, anti-partisan operation, as they might have put it. So they might have, reckoned it might take a week, but then we're already at day 17 and they're still fighting on. And if anything, they're not the insurgents are not necessarily making gains, but the Germans are not exactly making gains either. So it's an element of stalemate, and I think that the German forces are surprised by that, and that's expressed in this entry from the combat diary of the German Ninth Army, which talks about sort of bringing in reinforcements of the Wehrmacht, SS, and so on into Warsaw, and says the losses of German units are high in the city, and their striking power is decreasing day by day. The quelling of the uprising, which is a vital issue for the Ninth Army and of great political importance, is floundering after initial successes. Today, it says, the strike groups have also made no significant progress. So really an admission that the quelling of the uprising really isn't going as well as it should have done. The second entry is from our old favourite, the SS leader in Warsaw, Erich von den Bach-Zelewski, who's a thoroughly odious individual. I always say he looks, like, if you ever see a picture of him, he looks like a provincial accountant. He has little sort of wire-rimmed glasses. He's quite plump. And he looks like a provincial accountant rather than a senior SS man and responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of individuals. But his diary from this episode is enlightening. We've used it a few times. And on the 17th, he says,
"Today I was on the road all day in Warsaw with the army. Tomorrow will be a hard day in Warsaw, which will determine whether our forces will succeed at all. Poles fight fiercely for every house. We are waiting here from hour to hour for the decisive blows of the Bolsheviks. All around me there is only great loneliness of death and concern for Germany."
So you can see in that again this concern. What comes next? What happens after Warsaw falls? And what's the next episode in this great narrative of the war?
Thank you so much for joining us on day 17. Make sure you tune in tomorrow for day 18. And remember, if you do like us, do go and leave a review on your favourite listening platform. And we'll see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.